Hello and welcome back to Health Unlock, the power of salutogenesis with Jason. Jason, how are you?
Not too bad. As we were discussing earlier, it's busy.
Yeah, I know. Jason was telling me he did a lot of renovation and barely got any break during holiday, except a few days. Those were actually public holidays.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Jason, anyway, I hope you still got some rest and things are in place and you're ready to take on 2026. So, we'll start with this recording, which is today we are covering really the device pathway and more details on DeSci, how you're thinking about it, more details on everything that we have talked in the past episode. So, let's go into the conversation. So, first question is what makes something a drug versus a device, and why does that matter for IBAL?
Okay. So most people, hear the FDA and they kind of automatically picture the drug model where you pick a target, you build a molecule, and then you spend a decade proving that you can force biology to comply to whatever it is that you want. The core distinction between the two really, I guess in plain terms, is this. So drugs achieve their primary intended purpose through pharmacologic, metabolic, or immunologic action. We've talked about that before, PMI. And that's really what's meant by pharmacology. You bind a receptor or block a pathway, inhibit an enzyme, modulate an immune signal, or you change things via metabolism or something like that. When you do that, you inherit this kind of whole universe of questions that the drug process or the drug development process itself is designed to answer. Things such as, well, what's the dose response? Are there off-target effects? Are there long tail interactions? And then also what happens within a body that's already stressed, so on and so forth. IBAL isn't built on that model at all. IBAL supplies localized essential metal cofactors to restore missing local inputs. And what we see from that, or what we keep seeing, is across all sorts of cases, a bunch of cases, is that the healing state progresses. So cells stop stalling and move through the healing cycle. And that matters because the development strategy really changes, right? So we're not trapped into this kind of, prove the entire universe of everything before anything ships. It kind of becomes a platform, or IBAL becomes a platform that can be developed in layers, with the same platform, different claim layers, where so we start with where the evidence is clear, and then we can expand as the stack kind of earns credit with other indications as well.
And what device pathways are you actually talking about? Like we have spoken in the past 510K, and then there is PMA, de novo, and what evidence does it require? Can you go into those details?
Yeah, sure. So on the device side, there are those three big lanes to understand. First is that 510K. That is the substantial equivalence route. Basically, you're saying what we're doing, or how would you say that? We're doing the same category of job as something else that's already cleared. And let me translate that. We're not asking the FDA to believe in a new religion on day one. We're saying, here's the category of work. Here's how we're doing it safely. And here's the evidence that it performs. And so the second is de novo. That's for something that's novel, but still sits in a lower to moderate risk profile where you can define the controls and the evidence without needing the highest burden path. And then the third is the PMA, which is pre-market approval. That's the highest risk and highest burden. It's for when a medical device could be as dangerous as a drug. Well, it might be still easier than the drug development process. It's approaching equivalence to drug development. And the evidence logic for devices differs from that, from drugs. But, it's still a real thing. The expectation there is show safety and performance, show the device does what it claims, and show that the risk is understood and controlled. And so I guess timelines and costs vary across those, but in general, the device path is years faster and an order of magnitude less expensive than developing a novel drug. So I guess to put all of this in plain English, the real work looks like this. Define the intended use and indications of your device tightly, build the quality system, do risk management, do safety testing, handle human factors and labeling, and generate the clinical evidence if the claims require it. And that's kind of the path. Currently, the first IBAL-based medical product is a Class 2 medical device for infection control and wound healing. And while I'd argue that it's dramatically better than anything else on the market, its mode of action is the same as that of other infection control and wound healing devices, at least at a high level. That means that the initial pathway into the US would be via 510K, that equivalence pathway.
Does it matter that if the eyeball does more than the 510K requirements of matching to something that already exists in med device world, but it does more than that, and that could be a hurdle to get that approval for 510K?
No, not necessarily. So most of it all comes down to what you're claiming it does, not necessarily what it actually does, meaning it could do other things, but as long as you're not claiming them, then you can kind of ignore them, unless, of course, those are material or materially important, and whether or not that they could cause a safety issue, right? So safety is safety regardless of what you claim. Anything, safety is safety. And that has to be satisfied. But the FDA looks at what are you claiming that it does, and how does it achieve what you're claiming.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess let's give the overview. Where are you already operating internationally?
Yep.
And what does that signal about the path to what you're thinking?
Okay, so we already have international regulatory, significant progress in real world deployment experience. We've navigated Cofepris in Mexico and MOHAP in the UAE, and the ion gel is on the market in both locations. And that matters because it greatly de-risks the kind of the unglamorous parts. You've got manufacturing, distribution, quality discipline, labeling realities, and even the patient feedback loops, right? So all of that doesn't necessarily mean that FDA approval is automatic, but it does mean that we're not walking into the US process empty-handed. And really the biggest way people kind of get this wrong in the US is not, at least especially within our case, wouldn't be the science here. It's the story that they would tell about the science. And then that story, basically the claims that you're making, determine what you have to prove.
So, I mean, obviously you are in far better shape. You are already approved for Mexico and UAE. Different regulations for sure. But like you said, it makes it easier when you're making the case now in the US market. Does this, I guess the question is, definitely does not eliminates the path, the international things in the US, time-wise, right? It does not change anything on the timeline-wise for the approval processes. It's only just credibility and data.
Well, no, because I mean, from a time perspective, okay, if you're simply saying, "Hey, I'm doing the same thing as they're doing," and in our case, it's if you look at that device, and that device, we do the same thing as all three of those. That means that now the FDA has a real clear picture of what you're doing and how you're doing it and why. So now you just have to show specific efficacy and specific safety. And in truth, we've already done that. We've done that in Mexico and the UAE. So now it's really just the FDA is going to look at the data and say, no, there are too many Mexicans. We want more, white people or Asian people or somebody else, right? Because Mexico has lots of Mexicans. And, so that's a possibility. But in truth, the data that we got is pretty broad across sex and race. And, fact of the matter is the way that it works really has nothing to do with the color of your skin. It's.
Yeah, I guess that's what you are claiming, and you got to prove it.
Yes.
So that's important. Yeah. Okay, so I guess also what could make the regulators to say no? Like, what are the hard parts and failure modes?
So as I kind of mentioned, the failure mode really wouldn't be a lab failure, if you will. Again, we've already proven safety and efficacy. It would be more of a language failure. And this is kind of the part where, a single verb used wrong can cost you 3 years. If we describe IBAL with drug words and everyone hears a drug story, then suddenly we're defending claims that we never really meant to make. And the FDA might, or actually any regulatory agency might simply say, oh, well, then you're a drug. And just to clarify, almost all jurisdictions in different countries, yeah, there are little differences, but they pretty much all handle drugs as drugs in the same way and devices as devices kind of in the same way. But so again, if you're not clear on what pharmacology is and is not, it can be really easy to frame what IBAL does incorrectly, such that it sounds like a drug, right? And we also have to remember there's a deep bias in medicine that for something to have significant efficacy, it has to be coercive. It has to be cratogenic, right? So remember what that means is cells are not doing what, at least this is the bias. Cells are not doing what they are supposed to be doing. Therefore, we have to force them to do that, whatever it is we want. And that's a drug story. Drugs do things like receptor binding or blockade, enzyme inhibition or activation, altering signal cascades, immune modulation through different molecular signaling and metabolic modulation, all sorts of these things. IBAL's a completely different model. At its core, it supplies nutrients. The novel aspect of that is that it does so locally and with nutrients that are already in a form that can be immediately utilized. They don't need to be metabolized at all. So really, there are two kinds of failures there. One would be misframing. We accidentally tell a drug story. And then the other would be overreach. We claim more than the evidence can support. Actually, you mind if I go off on a quick little aside here for a second? Because people kind of love a villain. It's not really all that the pharma industry is evil. There's a legitimate reason that most supplements, because I was just kind of tying this sort of to supplements, but the reason that most supplements never become regulated therapies, allowing for actual legal medical claims. The moment you want these kind of disease level claims, you inherit drug level questions, right? And that's dose, impurities, interactions, distribution, how it gets into the body, accumulation, byproducts, all this kind of stuff. And all of those things may necessarily apply because almost all supplements must be metabolized by the body to turn it from one form into the bioavailable form of that nutrient, whatever it is. And drug development specifically exists to answer all of those questions. And it's also expensive enough that without a clear return on investment, usually via patents and such, nobody can fund that work. I don't care if you're a rich pharma company. If you keep funding things that anyone else can come along and just say, oh, I'm doing the same thing they're doing, and you can't keep them from doing that, well, you spent $1 billion to get through the process and they spend, a few million, and you're going to go out of business. So even the large pharma companies can't do that. And so really for, if I return to kind of IBAL's device strategy here, as I mentioned, the failing modes are pretty straightforward, right? If the primary mode of action is interpreted as pharmacologic, metabolic, or immunologic for the intended claim, whatever that is, we might end up being pushed into a combination product territory, basically a drug. And if the claim is too broad, then the evidence burden kind of explodes, even if you stay within a medical device. If you can't demonstrate, your ability to manufacture and quality system stuff, then kind of nothing else matters. And then also, if you get safety signals that start to emerge, then the claim scope kind of needs to shrink a little bit, or you have to pause the project entirely. But we're kind of past all of that. And so that's where I think we're in a much better position than most projects would be. Well, for sure, we've got an approved product.
Yeah, I mean, the question I was going to ask was like, you said you're past of all of that is because you're already approved in those two countries. That's why you're saying that?
Yeah. So now all we have to do is package the data and bring it to the US, package the data in the way that the US wants to see it, and add to any of it where, if the US says, Mexico doesn't care about this stuff as much as we do, we want you to do a little bit more testing here or there or whatever.
Yeah.
But also remember, we're not just taking an application that we gave to Mexico, to COFEPRIS, and turning around and giving it to the US. We now also have real world use data. It's being used in clinics. Doctors are using it. That's a lot different than, that's well beyond the initial testing that we did to get it approved.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I heard you refer to this as a moral and structural issue. And talking about that, why do you say that?
Well, so again, it's not really about the regulators being evil, right? It's about kind of the incentive design. So when the system is optimized for pharma economics, anything that doesn't really fit the pharma story kind of gets punished, and not always on purpose, but structurally. So the pharma limbo, if you will, kind of has three predictable outcomes. You've got delay, and that's where patients end up having to wait years while, I guess, reality is translated into an approval and reimbursement narrative. You've got distortion, and where the intervention is, it needs to be reshaped to fit the system rather than building what works. And then you've got extraction, which is, the only capital that can survive the delay demands of that kind of governance, control, and pricing. So yeah, I guess the way to put that is the only capital that can survive that type of a delay and that much capital, right? They demand governance, control, pricing power, and restricting access, and so on.
He's still there?
Yeah. Did we get stuck?
Yeah, you got frozen a bit. So
Sorry?
you said, can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, you got frozen and disconnected for a little bit when you were saying only capital that gets stuck.
Okay.
And that's when, say that point
Okay,
again.
I'll restate that. So then the third one is extraction, right? Where the only capital that can withstand those delays and that total amount, they will demand control. And, so they can control the pricing and they can restrict access and all of those types of things. That's really why I call this a moral issue. People suffer not because we lack something that's safe and effective, but because the rails of development and reimbursement are misaligned with outcomes, right? So, a way to put that, I guess, is it's not the paperwork that's the villain; it's the misfit that is. While when the system kind of only recognizes that the coercion or the cratogenic drug mechanisms, it then kind of struggles to recognize enablement, which is really the salutogenic process.
Yeah. And how do you think DeSci and DAO change funding, governance, and speed without mission drift? Because, things can still happen to a certain level, but go into those details.
Yeah. So again, that's what I find really, really interesting. But we have to remember, right? So DeSci isn't this, magic money. It's governance plus transparency, I guess also plus aligned capital. The first kind of unlock is sequencing, right? So we can develop IBAL through these staged claim layers with tight milestones rather than a single all or nothing bet. Most biomedical companies have one specific thing they're trying to do. And again, most of the time that's cratogenic and everything is bet on that. IBAL can do lots of different things into different indications. Well, maybe I shouldn't phrase it that way. IBAL is relevant to lots of different indications just because all it's doing is supplying the nutrients needed for the local cells to do the right thing. Well, that can be kind of any indication. So if we go back to traditional funding, that comes with, with a trade-off. You've got, I guess the trade there is capital in exchange for governance. You give away your control. And that tends to push towards extraction, narrow indications, premium pricing, and a roadmap completely filtered through ROI. DeSci can flip that order where the community directs funds to the evidence that it wants to exist. The community can see what was funded, why, what worked, what failed, and then governance can help keep everything aligned with the mission, not just the margin, right? Because remember, the people who are actually governing don't have a direct link to a return on investment, right? So just because something, a product gets sold does not mean that token holders make money. It's not now they might, as a course of reality, but it's not a direct link. And so the IF DAO is the mechanism here that makes that governance real. It sets kind of priorities and evidence thresholds and access guardrails. So, and I want to emphasize that DeSci doesn't replace the rigor. It just replaces the misalignment. It sort of corrects that.
Yeah. And I guess that reduces the time to market as well with all these steps.
Well, yes. So I guess I didn't mention that. So with DeSci, you can make decisions a little bit faster. You can call for a DAO vote. It does, that's very different from a board vote. You can do it within almost instantaneously. Something pops up on everyone's screen. Who cares? They go through it. They yay, nay, that's it. Whereas traditionally you have to schedule board meetings and there are requirements that, it can only be, you have to give them a certain amount of notice and so on and so forth. And in which case that also means that boards don't end up making those decisions because they take too long. And so now you've got somebody else making your decisions that could have all sorts of biases themselves. They might not have all of the experience that's needed, whereas, your entire board probably does. But again, they can't make the decisions. They're just really looking at the decision saying, oh, you did good, or oh, no, you did bad. Don't do it that way next time. So yeah, that whole, all of that can then compress timelines pretty significantly.
And can you give a concrete scenario and an indication example and how governance would approve it once it's in the process?
Yeah, I guess that is a little bit confusing. So let's start with the beachhead that we already understand, and that's kind of infection control and wound healing. Those are concrete endpoints with a fast iteration cycle and clear evidence. So in this case, we wouldn't be saying, please fund IBAL. We'd be saying, help us define the next claim layer for this specific use case. So now governance then can vote on the scope, the claim layer, the endpoints, the evidence plan, the budget milestones, even partner requirements and access guardrails, right? So, and we can make a kind of explicit deal with the community, the token holders, that, they're not going to be any backroom deals. There's no selective screenshots, no, just, trust us. If the data is messy, we say it's messy. If it fails, we say it failed. And that's what kind of real transparency means there, and how you keep governance relevant. Otherwise, the people who are governing things aren't getting all of the real information, in which case you're likely making the wrong decisions. So this allows an execution team to kind of run the specific work, and that can be, you can hire anyone to do that work. Then the evidence gets published, good or bad. And the next claim layer is only proposed if the data warrants it. So I guess a way to look at that is governance really chooses the project and the rules, the teams execute, and then the evidence lets you decide what scales. And again, the disconnect or the difference is that the token holders who are governing don't have a direct link to a return on investment. Now, as I said, they might, as a matter of course, they might actually make money anyways, but it allows them, but because there's no direct link, it allows them to make the best decisions for the mission, not the best decisions for, well, how do we make this stuff increase in value? Because then that'll put money in my pocket, right? That's going to change, or at least bias the decisions I'm going to make. Whereas if it's, I might make money indirectly, okay, great. But in that case, then I don't care about any specific decision. I care that the overall decisions are moving in the right direction. And so, assuming I'm not being shown faulty data, then I can actually make the right decisions. And it won't be, let's just sweep some of this data under the rug and not talk about it. Because eventually that's going to bite you in the ass.
And this governance of data and everything is system controlled, transparent to everyone. There's no nothing like one person controlling it, right?
No, so that's the beauty of that is you can put all of this onto smart contracts on the blockchain. And so, if you tried to manipulate things, everyone can see it.
Yeah.
And then you get punished.
Yeah. So it's very, governance chooses the project and the rules. Various teams are working on it, executing it. And then there is data and evidence that's going to be along the way with it to make those things, execution and decisions.
Yeah. And you can say, well, but that's normal, right? Well, yes, except that everyone has, in the normal venture capital process, everyone has such a strong tie directly to return on investment. We need, right? In that situation, I'm a VC. I need all of the things to go the correct way. And if they don't, I actually have a reason to kind of fudge the data to make it look good, because I'm going to have an exit much earlier than, probably long before that the data comes out that we fudged everything and it's actually nowhere near as effective or nowhere near as safe as we said it was. I've already sold it off to some pharma company and taken my money and run away.
Yeah. And of course, we've seen cases where how it ends when you fudge the data, especially. And, I don't want to go back to Turnos. Everybody, even after fooling everyone, they're still there. That's going on.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess last important question here is, what does this unlock if it works? And what is it realistic timeline range for the entire this process?
So if this works, the unlock isn't necessarily this, miracle product that, we're calling IBAL. It's a repeatable development pattern for terrain-aligned interventions that don't fit the single target drug story, right? So that's really hard at the moment. And we get speed with kind of discipline here. You've got your staged claim layers, fast feedback, a couple of that with the, no need to pretend that you've proven everything all at once. You can then go and expand the platform, and new use cases become separate fundable evidence modules. And we get access control. Governance can prevent that kind of usual drift toward best ROI only and premium pricing only. Not that those are necessarily bad things, especially when you've got so many pathways to get this to people. It's okay to be able to make some money too. That's I'm not saying it's not. Timeline wise, early narrow programs can move on the order of months to a couple of years, depending on the endpoints and the evidence burden there. Then, broader expansion is multi-year because evidence and the manufacturing maturity and everything start to take more time. The difference of all of that versus the pharma right now is that we can start helping people now, learning and scaling stepwise instead of waiting a decade for this kind of single binary approval moment. So we're not trying to win one bet. We've kind of already done that with the ion gel. It's, again, that's a topical approved for infection control and wound healing. As we've kind of discussed, there are a whole ton of other things that IBAL is applicable to. And as we hit milestones and show that this stuff works, now this is hard because it's a paradigm shift, right? So initially people don't believe this. And if I just told you how well it was going to work on wound healing, you would say, yeah, that doesn't really make sense. I don't believe you. But now that I can start showing you all of the clinical data, okay, can't really argue with that. And as more and more of that happens, well, then, and some people will be using the ion gel on skin cancer, and then they'll turn around and they'll give us all the information, how well it's working, and we can use that information as data to actually apply for that indication, and we can add new indications on. Yes, that will take more money and more time, but at the same time, we have the product already approved that can be being used by people. So again, we're not trying to win that one bet. We're trying to build kind of this machine that can keep producing evidence and shipping real world impact and, spreading out broader and into broader and broader indications. And that's what I think is super exciting.
And of course, in your case, you also have data because you already have clinical data in other countries too.
Oh, well, yeah. So absolutely. The first hardest step, that's done. We've already got that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, this has been a quick but very useful conversation. And before we conclude this conversation, any last points you want to add, especially in terms of anything that we missed that you might think is still relevant in this conversation?
Oh boy, that's a dangerous question. At the moment, I'll say no, but I'm sure there's plenty of things that I haven't described well enough and we haven't talked about yet.
Okay. Well, anyway, we will come back to our next conversation to cover more details. Once again, Jason, thanks for taking the time and going through these steps. It definitely feels a no-brainer to do it. It's just because how efficient this paper process is on paper, for sure. But also just the state of it is also way ahead. Like this is already approved in 2 countries. There's real evidence in terms of people who've used it in the clinics as well. So there's a lot of things that exist which we are questioning that might cause problem. And those things exist for you.
So one way of looking at this is there's a paradigm shift with, everything around this, right? And paradigm shifts follow an interesting kind of awareness or increasing of awareness. Early on, right? So, it follows an exponential curve, right? Early on, that means it's really flat. Almost no one knows about it for a decently long time. And then, you get different people, different things, different data points that influence things. And, it increases and creeps up a little bit. And then you get to a point where awareness is increasing very rapidly. And then you get to a point where everyone says, well, everybody knows this. This is common sense. And so early on, and that's part of the reason why we developed the product in the first medical product in Mexico on our own without going and getting venture capital or trying to get any capital, is because we were too far down on that curve where it's flat, where the return on what you put into it is very low. Once that curve is starting to go up, well, then the return is much better. Now you can tell people about it and they say, oh, yeah, I actually already know that. I didn't quite know everything you were saying and now I know it better, but I already knew that. Whereas early on, it was, okay, here's how all of this stuff works. And they say, what? But that's completely different than what I've been told my entire life. Doctors will say, yeah, that's completely different than what I was taught at medical school, in which case you're wrong. And so it takes a little while to get past that. But some of those kind of things that cause inflection points are getting an approved product, having data that nobody can, you can't say, I'll trust you or I won't. You don't have to trust the medical data. It is what it is.
Yeah. Speaking of trust, in our follow-up conversation, this is what we're going to talk about it, the more of applications of the ion gel and showcase how it's different from traditional medicine and with full transparency and obviously with data, what you have and you'll share. So yeah, we'll come back in the follow-up conversation, and to our listeners, come back for this. These are not just made up claims. This is real data, and real evidence behind it.
Yeah. And again, it's also, so the evidence that we're seeing, we also have that problem where the efficacy is so great, people don't believe that it can be done with something that is closer to a supplement than it is to a drug. That doesn't make sense. From the way that they think about how biology works, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, this is too good to be true problem. It's like one of those things, and
for sure, most things that sound too good to be true are. And so, whenever you run across one that's not, it takes a long time for you to be convinced that it's not. Me too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
It took me a long time to believe that this was real. And then it took me
Yeah.
a long time to figure out how it was working, why it was working, what it was doing, and what it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, all right. I guess we'll conclude this episode today and we'll be back again with the next one. But for now, again, thanks again, Jason. Thanks for sharing all the insights. Much appreciated. And to our listeners, thanks for listening and come back to the next one. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.